At 3:26 a.m. on August 7th, 1985, a very distraught man called the police and he said, "I think my father is in mortal danger. He lives down the road from me. I was just on the phone with him and it seems like something is totally wrong. Can you please go check on him?" The police tell him to calm down and explain really what's going on here, what happened on the phone. And so the man, whose name was Jeremy, said his dad called him and he was talking about his daughter, so Jeremy's sister, and her name was Sheila. And he's like, "Sheila's gone crazy. She's gone berserk and I think she has a gun." And Jeremy's telling police that he didn't know what his dad was talking about and he's trying to get more information from his dad. He's like, "What do you mean she's got a gun? What's going on over there?" But at some point in this phone call with his father, the phone line just cuts out. And Jeremy's left with all these questions that have gone unanswered. He tried calling back, but it didn't go through, and that's when he called the police. The police asked Jeremy if he had heard any shots fired in the background before the phone cut out. And Jeremy says, "No, but my sister is schizophrenic, she's got a bad temper, and she had been fighting with my parents all week, in particular with my dad. And right before the phone cut out, my dad sounded really scared, like something bad was about to happen or was happening. And so we need to get over there right now." And so the police say, "Okay, we're going to check it out right now." So they hang up with Jeremy and the police head down the road towards White House Farms, where Jeremy's father lives. They park a little ways away from the house itself, safely behind a wall and some trees, because they don't want to go too close in case Sheila really does have a gun and starts shooting at them. As the police are getting out of their vehicle, another car comes driving down the road from the same direction the police had come from. The police tell them to stop and the person gets out and it turns out it's Jeremy. He didn't live that far away and he comes running over and he's like, "We got to go in there. You have to go in there right now." And the police are like, "We're not going to do that. You stay with your car." Before the police were prepared to go into this house, they wanted to scope it out and get a sense of what was going on because they really didn't know anything about the house besides what Jeremy told them. So a small group of police officers goes behind this other building that's kind of adjacent to the White House Farms, but pretty close to the actual farmhouse. And they go around the backside and they peek around the corner and they start looking at the house. And it's still dark outside. And there's a couple of lights on inside the house and there's no movement, there's no sound, and they're just staring at it. And then one of the officers notices movement, or what he thinks is movement, up in the second floor. And the group of them back up behind the building. They didn't want to be seen. They were worried if Sheila saw them, it would trigger her to harm the other people in the house or harm herself. So they back up away from this building, making sure to stay out of sight of that second floor window and really out of sight of any of the windows on this farmhouse. And they go back to the intersection where the police cars are and where Jeremy is, and they decide they're going to take the diplomatic approach. And so they call in a negotiator who, with a bullhorn, goes up behind that little building and they start calling out to Sheila, trying to get her to peacefully put her weapon down and come outside. But there's no sound in the house. There's no more movement in the house as far as anyone can tell. And this turns into a multi-hour long standoff where no one comes out of the house, no one goes into the house, and then the sun comes up and the police are starting to get frustrated. And so they eventually call the negotiator back and they say, "Okay, we're going to need to make entry." A small group of police assaulters began making their way up towards the farmhouse. They get up to the door, it's locked. They try the other door, it's locked. All the windows are locked. And so they bring up a sledgehammer, smashed on the front door, and they make entry into this hallway. They immediately make a right, and they're getting ready to confront Sheila wherever she is, but they don't see her. They go all the way down this hallway, and it opens up into the kitchen. And hunched over the stove is a man who's clearly deceased, who winds up being Jeremy's father. He had been shot to death, and he's laying in the kitchen. So they find him. They scan the rest of the kitchen and they look all around the first floor and there's no one else down there. And this whole time, they're not hearing any other noises in the house. It's totally silent. They make their way upstairs, and as soon as they get to the top of the stairs, they go right into the first room on the right, and laying on the bed is a deceased older woman who's also been shot to death, and that would wind up being Jeremy's mother. Laying on the ground next to the bed was a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, who would wind up being Jeremy's sister, so Sheila, the one who had gone berserk apparently according to the father. She's laying on the ground and she has a rifle that's over her chest and the barrel is pointed up towards her head, and she has a gunshot wound that's going in underneath her chin, and so she's deceased as well. The police leave that room, they go across the hall into another bedroom, and when they go inside, they find two more bodies that are both laying in their beds. They were 6-year-old twins. They were Sheila's sons. They had both been shot to death as well. After that, there was nobody else in the house, so all of the family has been wiped out. Very quickly, this case was labeled a clear-cut murder-suicide perpetrated by Sheila. She had a history of mental illness. She had apparently gone berserk that night, and she had a gun. Everything fit. And so the police were ready to just write this off as a murder-suicide, especially with the amount of media attention this case got. There was a lot of pressure to just solve this case and move on. And so murder-suicide became the answer, and they were not looking for any other answer. But there was one detective that was not willing to accept that this was clearly a murder-suicide, and he had a couple reasons for it. The first thing he noticed, because he was there when the bodies were discovered, was Sheila was carrying a rifle that had a 10-round magazine, and Sheila did not have any pockets on the clothes she had on when they found her. That's important because she fired 25 shots. So that required 2 reloads, except the ammunition to this gun was downstairs, and a lot of the shooting happened upstairs. So after her first volley of fire on the second floor, where presumably you have at least a couple people that are still totally alive, she had to walk downstairs, reload the gun, come back upstairs, do her second volley of fire, go back downstairs, reload that second time, and then she finishes her course of fire. And it made him wonder, why didn't anybody try to stop her while she was doing the reload? Because it required going all the way down, getting the rounds, jamming them into the magazine, putting it into the gun, and then going back upstairs. That's a lot of time that other people could have potentially tried to stop her, or at a minimum, just tried to escape. But it was like everybody just laid in bed. It was like they didn't know what was happening despite so many rounds being fired very close to them. Stan also found out Sheila did not have extensive weapons training. And so she wouldn't be natural at reloading a weapon. And so for her to go down and reload twice and not chip any of her nails, she had long painted nails, that seemed like a bit of a stretch because that requires pretty coordinated movements. And for her to never have done that before and just to be able to easily reload, that seems like a stretch too. Stan also figured out there was a window that had a faulty latch on it, that if you pulled lightly on it, it would stay locked. But if you pulled hard and kind of jostled it around, it could open and it could shut, which means the house was not secure when they got there, even though they thought it was. And that was a big part of their whole, this is a murder-suicide, because Sheila locked all the doors and windows before she committed this crime. But if any of those doors or windows were open, it kind of leaves open the opportunity for someone else to have gotten in there and gotten out before the police. But the biggest discovery by far that puts all the others to shame is something Stan found under the stairs inside the house. And everything before that, all the evidence that Stan was presenting to the other officers saying, hey, we should take a look at this. I don't know if this is a murder-suicide. I think there might be potential for somebody else to be responsible. Well, no one was taking him seriously until he came to the table with what he found underneath the stairs. Everybody had to stop what they were doing and say, okay, yeah, we need to look closer at this. And so if you want to learn more about that, go ahead and click on the link inside of the description. It will bring you to the landing page where you can watch this series that I've been raving about. It's on HBO Max and it's called The Murders at the White House Farm. And it does a great job of showcasing this huge find and then the follow-on plot twist. On the morning of November 13th, 1974, 6 members of the DeFeo family were asleep in their home in Amityville, New York. The 7th member of the family, Ron, was sitting on his bed in the basement. At around 1 a.m., he gets up off his bed, he grabs a rifle, and he starts walking up the stairs. He goes across the first floor, goes up the second floor stairs, and he gets to the second floor landing, and he walks right into his parents' bedroom, which was totally dark besides this little candle that had been lit next to his father's bedside, and he raises his rifle and he puts 2 rounds into his father's back. And then as soon as his father is still, he aims at his mother and he shoots her 2 times. And then he puts the gun down and he walks out and he goes across the hall into his brother's room. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot into his 12-year-old brother Mark, and then he aims at his 9-year-old brother John and he fires 1 shot into him as well. Then he leaves their bedroom and he walks down the hall to another bedroom where he finds his 13-year-old sister Allison. He raises his rifle and he fires 1 shot. He leaves her room, he goes up the 3rd set of stairs up onto the 3rd floor, he finds his 18-year-old sister Dawn, and he fires 1 shot into her, and then he was done. Altogether, it took Ron about 15 minutes to massacre his family. At no point was he panicked or running around or acting crazy. He was just walking calmly room to room, taking very well-aimed shots. to ensure they didn't get up again. He put the rifle down and he went outside and he jogged to a bar where he went inside and he put on this big facade that he had just found his family and they were hurt and could you come help him? And when they got to the house, he refused to go inside, but the people from the bar went inside and they discovered this horrible scene. And when the police show up, Ron goes over to them and he actually confesses and says, "I killed my family." Even though the DeFeo family had a reputation for being very dysfunctional, it was Ron who had the worst reputation. He was known around Amityville for heavy drug use, for being a total alcoholic, and for getting really aggressive and confrontational with people. He was just a guy no one wanted to be around. And so when news got out in Amityville that this horrible thing has happened, and it looks like Ron is the one who did it, no one was really that shocked. But when details of the crime scene, specifically the way the bodies were positioned, made people wonder, is there more to this case that we don't know about? All of the DeFeo family members had been found lying face down in their beds, and none of them showed any signs of putting up a struggle against their attacker, which led investigators initially to think that they must have been sedated, that Ron must have drugged them somehow before he carried out this attack. But when the toxicology reports came back, no one in the family had any substance in their system. At first, the police did not think that was a very big deal. They figured, you know what? The family just must not have heard the different gunshots. He wasn't shooting lots of rounds. It was, one single round here, one single round here, that perhaps they just didn't hear it, and that's why no one tried to escape. But it turns out the rifle Ron was using, the .35 caliber Mrballen, is one of the loudest rifles you can own. And in fact, investigators went out and did a test with it, and they fired it indoors, and you could easily hear it a mile away. And so investigators said, well, then it looks like they must have heard these gunshots, but for some reason, didn't get out of their beds. They didn't try to fight back in any way. They just kind of took it. And then you have the weirdness of Ron's confession. On the night of the attack, when Ron is sitting on his bed and he can't sleep and everybody else is asleep upstairs, he starts hearing a voice in his head that's saying, "Catch them, kill them." And he thinks he's just losing his mind. But then out of the shadows, straight across from him, from underneath the steps in the basement, this shadowy figure emerges and starts walking towards him, and he can see what looks like its mouth moving and saying the words, "Catch them, kill them." And Ron's looking up at it as this figure walks all the way up to him and bends down and gets right next to his ear. And he says right into his ear, "Catch them, kill them." And then Ron said involuntarily he reached over to the rifle that was on the bed with him, and he stood up and he began walking towards the steps. And he knew what was going to happen. He was going to go kill his family, and he didn't want to do it. But he felt like he didn't have any more control over his body, and that's when he realized he was being possessed by this demon in the basement. While Ron's confession terrified everybody in Amityville, the idea that there was a demon living in the basement of this house that possessed someone to go kill their family, that terrified everybody, but it didn't hold up in court, and ultimately Ron was sent to jail for life. 1 year after the attacks, another family, the Lutz family, moved into the house in Amityville. But they left 28 days later because they were hearing voices coming from the basement. After hearing about the mass murder that occurred in the house, and now the Lutz family saying that there's something in the basement, world-renowned demonologists Ed and Lorraine Warren, they descend on the property, and very quickly Ed and Lorraine say, yes, this house is definitely haunted. And in fact, to this day, the Amityville house is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. But while Ed and Lorraine were there, they took a very famous picture. Lorraine was walking around the second floor near where the brothers' room was, and she was snapping pictures, and the only people in the house at the time these pictures were being taken were her and her husband, Ed. And here is the picture that she took on the second floor. She claims this boy standing on the left side of the picture is the ghost of John DeFeo. Today, the house still stands, and it's been bought and sold a number of times over the years because apparently no one likes to live in this house for a very long time. On June 10th, 1912, the Moore family was sleeping peacefully in their beds on their quiet street in Villisca, Iowa. Joe and Sarah Moore, the mother and the father, were asleep upstairs in their room, and their 4 children were down the hall in another room. In addition to the Moore family sleeping upstairs, there was also 2 more children sleeping on the first floor in the guest room. It was the Stillinger sisters, and they were over for a sleepover. And unbeknownst to all the sleeping people in the house, there was a strange man who had broken into the house while they were at church, gone into the attic and was hiding in there, smoking cigarettes and carrying an axe. Shortly after midnight, this stranger believed the coast was clear, and they silently opened up the small door and they crouched down and walked out of the attic into the second floor hallway, wielding this axe in their left hand. They began walking down the hallway. They passed the children's room on their right, and they made their way down to the end of the hall where the master bedroom was. They walked inside the room and stood right next to Joe, and then violently raised the axe over their head, so quickly and so high that it actually struck the ceiling, and then brought it down blade first directly onto Joe's face, over and over and over again until Joe did not resemble a human being. While this was happening right next to her, Sarah's beginning to stir and look around what's going on. Meanwhile, the killer has now moved to the other side of the bed and is standing over Sarah and using the backside of the axe. So not the blade part, but the backside of the axe head. He raises it up and then brings it down on her head and repeatedly hits her over and over and over again until she too is indistinguishable and does not look like herself or even human. The killer is very calm. He takes the sheets and pulls them up over the faces of both of the people he just killed, and then he goes back out into the hall and he walks down and he goes into the children's room. One by one, he raises the axe and drops the axe on each of the children's heads, and then after they are deceased, he pulls the sheets up over their head. The killer leaves the room and goes downstairs to where the Stillinger sisters are, and then just like everybody else in the house, he raises the axe and drops it over and over and over again on the heads of each of these girls until they're no longer living as well. Afterwards, he raises the sheets over their faces, and now everyone in the house is deceased and has their face covered. At this point, the killer goes back upstairs and goes back into the master bedroom, and he stands in front of Joe and Sarah's bed, and after a little while, he begins striking them dozens more times, even though both of them were clearly deceased at this point. At this point, the killer shifted gears and began focusing on covering his tracks, cleaning up. And he began taking clothes out of closets and pulling whatever sheets he hadn't used. He began tacking these things up onto all of the windows and any spaces on the doors so that nobody could see in. He also began covering up the mirrors, which no one understood why he did that. After the house is totally covered up, the killer goes into the kitchen and he cooks himself a meal, but he doesn't eat the food. He cleaned off the axe and placed it up against the wall on the first floor. He then took a huge bowl, filled it up with water, and then washed his bloody hands and began to clean himself a little bit, and then he left the bloody water just sitting on the counter. And then, strangely, he took a huge slab of bacon from in the kitchen and he put it in the middle of the floor, and then next to it was a keychain. And some people think this might have to do with some ritual he was performing, but to this day, no one really knows why he did that. And then he took some keys from inside the house, walked out the door, turned around, locked it behind him, and disappeared. The Moore household normally was a very rambunctious place with all these kids running around, and the neighbors were very close. And so the next morning, when the neighbors did not see the Moore family coming outside to do their chores around 7 a.m., they were concerned, and they went over and they knocked on the door. There was no answer. They noticed everything had sheets over it, so they couldn't see inside. And so Joe's brother was hailed to the house, and he brought along a key, and he opened up the door and he walked inside, and he immediately saw the Stillinger sisters and what had been done to them. And he got incredibly sick, and he ran outside, and they called police. Police come down, and they find this horrible scene. Even though they have the murder weapon, they have the victims, their bodies are right here, there's blood, there's all sorts of stuff and things that the killer must have manipulated, and you would think there's enough here that you'd be able to refine your search to a couple different suspects and eventually figure out who did this, but they weren't able to. And to this day, we have no idea who did this. The house itself where the attack happened has not been updated since the attack. Somebody bought the property and then maintained it so it could be a tourist attraction. And so to this day, you can go to the Villisca axe murder house and you can stay there. You can sleep there overnight and you can actually tour the area, and it looks the same way it did when the murders happened. Many people believe that house is haunted. And in fact, in 2014, someone who was there staying overnight as a tourist inexplicably stabbed themselves and had to go to the hospital, and they don't even know why they did it. And so that's kind of added to the legend of the Villisca axe murder house, that the house itself will cause you to harm yourself. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you found the secret...
February 10th, 2003, 85-year-old Anna Mae Branson was standing in her bedroom closet on the second floor of her large home in Madisonville, Kentucky. Madisonville was a peaceful coal mining town that residents had nicknamed the best town on earth. Anna Mae was trying to pick out the perfect outfit to wear to a dance that she was going to the following night with her new fiancé. and she eyed a long black cape with a leopard print collar hanging in the closet, and she smiled. Anna May loved clothes, and at 85 years old, she still enjoyed getting all dressed up. So almost every time she left the house, she wore high heels, a huge sparkling diamond ring, and a perfectly styled wig. In fact, Anna May had built a reputation in town for dressing like a movie star for decades, and she wasn't about to give that up now just because some people saw her as an old lady. But Anna May had not always worn fancy clothes and expensive diamonds. She was born in Madisonville in 1917, the oldest of 5 siblings, and she had a pretty traditional upbringing that involved going to church regularly and helping her parents look after her younger siblings. And most people in town had made their living from working in the Kentucky coal mines or from running farms. But as Anna May grew up, she had discovered she was great with numbers and with money. And so at a time when there weren't a lot of career opportunities for women, she had dreamed of starting her own business someday. So after she had graduated high school and gotten married, she and her husband worked several different jobs and put away as much money as they could for the future. And then in 1950, when they'd saved up enough, they bought a Dairy Queen franchise and then opened the first fast food restaurant in Madisonville. And it turned out Madisonville loved Dairy Queen. And soon, Anna May and her husband's restaurant was the busiest place in town, and they were bringing in more money than they had ever imagined. Anna May and her husband had run the Dairy Queen successfully for 40 years, and over that long period of time, they had become 2 of the most well-known and beloved people in all of Madisonville. But then, in 1994, Anna May's husband passed away, and she didn't want to run the restaurant without him, so she had sold the Dairy Queen and walked away a millionaire. At the time, most of her family had assumed Anna May would retire, but she loved working and feeling like she was part of the community, so she had taken a chunk of the money she'd made from selling the Dairy Queen and invested it in rental homes and other real estate properties in the area. And so by now, she had been running her own real estate business for almost 10 years and had made a ton more money in the process. And she had no intention of retiring anytime soon. Back in the closet, Anna May walked over to the shelves that held her large shoe collection. But before she could decide which pair of high heels she should wear to the following night's dance, she heard the phone ring in the bedroom. So she stepped out of the closet, walked across her room, and grabbed the phone on the bedside table. And right away, as she listened to the voice on the other line, a very concerned look came across her face. There was a man yelling at her on the other line, and Anna May could not figure out what he was even saying. She asked the man to calm down and to please speak lower, but the man shouted that Anna May needed to come to his house as soon as she could. And Anna May finally recognized the voice. It was Robert Prince, a man who rented a house from her. So she asked Robert, what's wrong? What's going on here? How can I help? Then Robert got really quiet, and in almost a whisper, he said there were ghosts in his attic, and that Anna May had to come get the ghosts out of there. Then Robert hung up on the other line, and Anna May stood there in her bedroom with a stunned look on her face. She hung up the phone and sat down on her bed. Robert had always been a little weird and eccentric since he'd moved into one of her properties, but saying he saw ghosts in the attic was strange, even for him, and Anna May didn't know how to handle it. She worried if she called the police about this, Robert might get in some kind of trouble, and she didn't want that. So she decided she would call to check in on him over the weekend and then maybe pay him a visit on Monday if she needed to. Anna May took a deep breath and collected herself, but then a sudden knock at the front door startled her. And she laughed because she wondered if maybe one of her other renters was also coming to tell her that they had ghosts in their house too. So Anna May got up and headed downstairs, and when she opened the front door, a grin came across her face. Because it was not a renter scared of ghosts, it was her nephew, Russell Winstead. Russell smiled and gave his aunt a big hug. He was 37 years old, 6 foot 1 inches tall, and his brown hair was just starting to turn a little gray. Anna May's younger brothers and sisters all had children, so Anna May had a bunch of nieces and nephews. And all of those nieces and nephews said Anna May was like a second mom to them. And so, as Anna May had gotten older, the ones who still lived in Madisonville made it a point to stop by regularly to check on her and to make sure she wasn't alone too often in her big house. Anna May and Russell walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. And right away, Russell asked her how the real estate business was going. And Anna May just laughed and then told him about how Robert Prince, one of her renters, had actually just called and said there were ghosts in his attic. And so that was basically how the real estate business was going. But while Anna May laughed, Russell didn't. He did not think it was funny at all. He said it sounded like the guy was seriously disturbed, and he told Anna Mae not to go over to the house to see Robert by herself. He said if she really needed to see him, she should call him, Russell, or his dad, who was Anna Mae's youngest brother, and they would go with her. Anna Mae thanked Russell, but told him that really everything was fine, Robert Prince was harmless, and then she quickly changed the subject and asked how things were going with him. Russell filled her in on what his wife and kids were up to, and said they'd all see her at church on Sunday night, and then he also talked a little bit about how his work as a mining engineer was going. And then, after they talked a little while longer, Russell said he better get home for dinner, so he stood up, gave his aunt another big hug, and walked out. Once Russell was gone, Anna Mae headed back upstairs into her closet to settle on an outfit for the big dance she was going to the next day. And then, later that night, as she got ready for bed, she thought again about that phone call from Robert, and suddenly it really wasn't funny to her. Much like Russell, she did think that, maybe something was wrong with Robert. Maybe he really was disturbed, and that she needed to be really careful with him and not be alone with him. But by the following night, Saturday night, Anna Mae had put Robert and the ghosts in his attic out of her mind because she was having the best time she'd had in months, dancing with her new fiancé in an outfit that made her look like a movie star. The next day, on Sunday, January 12th, so 2 days after Anna Mae got that call about ghosts from Robert Prince, she was attending evening services at the church that was right across the street from her house. And at around 7 p.m., the service ended, and Anna Mae went to the lobby to say hi to some of her friends. And as she was there, her nephew Russell, who had visited her a couple days earlier, along with his wife and their kids, came over to talk to her for a bit. A little while later, Anna Mae said goodnight to everyone, stepped outside, and walked across the street to her house. She was wearing a sweater, her diamond ring, and one of her capes. When she got home, Anna Mae walked through the living room and back to the kitchen. She took off her cape and draped it over a kitchen chair. Then she made herself some soup and sat down to eat. But at 7:15 p.m., a few minutes after she'd begun eating, there was a loud knock at the front door. Now, visitors often stopped by to see Anna Mae after church, so she didn't think anything out of the ordinary was going on. So she walked to the front of the house, she opened the door, smiled, and said hello to the visitor standing there. Then the visitor stepped inside, but Anna Mae didn't notice that they were hiding something behind their back. The visitor then took a deep breath and then told Anna Mae that they really needed her help big time. But after hearing what they wanted, Anna Mae shook her head and said she would not do what the visitor was asking her to do. And then suddenly the visitor's face turned red and they started shouting at Anna Mae. A look of fear crossed Anna Mae's face and she took a few steps back, but the visitor moved in closer to her, shouting even louder and showing her what they had hiding behind their back. It was a 2-foot, 1/2-inch metal breaker bar, which is like a large socket wrench used to tighten or loosen rusted bolts. The visitor held the breaker bar above their head, and Anna Mae screamed. She held up her hands and tried to get the visitor to calm down, but they just kept on shouting. So Anna Mae finally turned around and moved as fast as she could through the living room, and then she rushed down a long hallway to a door that led into the basement. Anna Mae reached out, and the doorknob rattled in her shaking hands, but she flung the door open, slammed it behind her, and started down the stairs into the basement away from this person. But when she reached the bottom, she heard the door to the basement open again, and she turned back, looked up the stairs, and saw standing there was this person, breaker bar in hand over their head, and a second later they were charging down the stairs after her. At around 11:30 a.m. on the following morning, Anna Mae's new fiancé stepped out of his car and walked up to the front door of Anna Mae's house. He was there to pick her up for a lunch date they had planned. Anna Mae's fiancé was a retired doctor in his late 80s, and he never thought he would get married again so late in life. But when he had met Anna Mae, he'd fallen in love with her right away, and so he decided he wanted to spend whatever time he had left with her, and he had proposed, and Anna Mae had said yes. The fiancé knocked on the door and waited, but Anna Mae didn't answer, so he knocked again, and then he rang the doorbell. But still, there was nothing. So he leaned in close to the door to try to hear if there was any movement inside, but the house was quiet. And when a couple more minutes had passed with still no Anna Mae, he really started to worry. So he walked away from the house and went across the street to the church. He walked into the church lobby and stepped into a small office where a woman was sitting behind a desk, and he said he was worried something was wrong with Anna Mae, and he asked the woman to call 911 and then to please call Anna Mae's brother, Earl. The woman knew Anna Mae and her family very well, and she said she would take care of it. The fiancé thanked her, and then quickly he rushed out of the church and walked back across the street to Anna Mae's house. And in a matter of minutes, an officer from the Madisonville Police Department and Anna Mae's brother, Earl, pulled up in front of the house. Earl and the officer stepped out of their cars and headed towards the front door. Earl was 67 years old, 18 years younger than his sister, and like his son Russell, he had made it a habit to check on Anna Mae whenever he could. Earl said hello to the officer and the fiancé, and then walked right to a small bush by the porch. He crouched down and grabbed the spare key he knew Anna Mae kept hidden under that bush. Then, with the key, he unlocked the door and let the officer and Anna Mae's fiancé inside. Once inside, all three men started calling out for Anna Mae, but they got no response, so they split up. The officer headed upstairs, the fiancé went to the kitchen, and Earl walked through the living room. They were all concerned Anna Mae had possibly fallen and maybe been knocked unconscious, and Earl was worried that the fall could have taken place sometime the night before, and so she might have been out cold or injured for a long time. Earl called out for his sister again, but he still didn't get a response. So he walked down the hall to the basement door. Then he opened the door, turned on the light, and walked down the stairs. But when he got halfway down the stairs and looked at the floor below him, he screamed. Earl shook his head and he hoped that what he was looking at was some kind of nightmare or hallucination, but it was real, and he couldn't believe it. Anna Mae's body was lying on a rug on the basement floor. She was covered in blood, and her sweater and the shirt she'd been wearing under it were torn to shreds. Earl didn't know what had happened, but he knew this was not the result of a fall. Earl rushed down the rest of the stairs and stood over his sister's broken body. Tears started running down his cheeks, and he felt like he'd gotten the wind knocked out of him. Anna Mae had been about 18 when Earl was born, and she had always been protective of her youngest brother. And even when Earl was an adult with children of his own, Anna Mae had always looked out for Earl's family and helped them in any way she could. In the basement, Earl heard footsteps on the stairs. He looked up and saw Anna Mae's fiancé and the police officer, and when the fiancé saw Anna Mae on the floor, he broke down in tears just like Earl. But the police officer just stood there in shock. It had been 20 years since the last major homicide case had happened in Madisonville, and that was a long time before he, and a lot of people on Madisonville's small police force, had started their careers in law enforcement. The officer quickly called into the police station for backup, and he contacted the county sheriff's department. But he was pretty sure that even the county officers had not seen anything like this before. A few minutes after the call went out to the police and the sheriff's departments, Officer Kelly Rager of the Madisonville Police parked her cruiser in front of Anna Mae's house. She stepped outside and right away felt a chill run through her body. Winter temperatures had dropped below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but it wasn't the weather Rager was feeling. She was shaken because she knew the woman who had lived in this large two-story house. Officer Rager's mom and Anna Mae had been friends for years, and like so many people in Madisonville, Rager had looked up to Anna Mae, and she thought Anna Mae was an inspiration to people, and especially to women who wanted to pursue a career that some others thought women had no business doing. Officer Rager walked towards the front door and heard a car screech to a stop behind her. She turned around and saw Detective Scott Troutman from the Hopkins County Sheriff's Department step out of his car and walk towards her. The two young investigators greeted each other and talked briefly. They both knew they were coming to the scene of a homicide. And even though Troutman did not have a personal connection to the victim like Rager did, he knew how well loved Anna Mae and her family were throughout the area. So Troutman understood that this case was going to affect the entire community. The investigators walked into the house together and saw Earl and Anna Mae's fiancé sitting in the living room with the first officer who had arrived on the scene. All three of them looked like they were still in shock. Detective Troutman crossed over to Earl and the fiancé and told them how sorry he was, and then he asked if they wouldn't mind walking him through what had happened earlier that morning. And they both gave him an account of how they'd gotten to the house and how they'd found Anna Mae's body in the basement. Troutman thanked them for their time and told them investigators would follow up with them soon. Then he and Rager headed to the basement. Anna Mae had converted the basement almost into a small apartment. There was a living room with a comfortable couch, a bathroom with a shower in it, a washer and a dryer, and a small refrigerator and freezer. And when the investigators stepped into that basement, they saw Anna Mae lying face down on a rug in front of the couch. But something immediately stood out to both of them. There was a pool of blood around Anna Mae's body, but other than that, the basement looked totally clean. There was no blood spatter on the walls, the floor, or the stairs. The investigators knew they would have to do a thorough search of the basement, but at first glance, it looked like whoever had killed Anna Mae had taken the time to wipe down the entire crime scene. Detective Troutman did a walkthrough of the basement while Officer Rager crouched down on the floor next to Anna Mae's body to look more closely at the wounds. It was hard for her to concentrate because she couldn't understand how any human being could do something like this to a defenseless 85-year-old woman. But she took a deep breath and tried to leave her personal feelings aside and focused on finding evidence. And one of the first things she noticed was that Anna Mae was still wearing her large, expensive diamond ring. To Rager, this all but ruled out the murder being the result of a robbery. Because why would a robber leave behind such an obvious, expensive piece of jewelry? Then Troutman called Rager over to him. He was down on one knee, leaning in close to the small freezer that was pushed up against one of the walls. So Rager stood up and walked away from the body. Then she crouched down too, next to Troutman, and he pointed out 2 streaks of blood on the freezer. The only blood he'd found in the basement other than the blood right around Anna Mae. And Troutman told Rager that he thought there was something interesting about these streaks of blood. The streaks looked entirely different from each other. Troutman was not a blood spatter expert, but his first thought was that the 2 patterns had been made by 2 different weapons. And the idea that the killer took the time to use 2 separate weapons made him think they must have really wanted to inflict as much pain as possible, or that they had had a mental break and had gone into some kind of frenzied attack. And then, not long after the discovery of these unique blood streaks on the freezer, forensics experts from the county arrived, and they confirmed Troutman's hunch. They said 2 weapons had been used in the attack on Anna Mae. And they also confirmed that someone had cleaned the crime scene, but must have just missed the marks on the freezer. And so while the forensics team did a thorough investigation of the basement and the body, Troutman and Rager went outside and interviewed neighbors to find out if anybody had seen anything out of the ordinary that morning or the night before. But the only information they got was that one neighbor thought she might have seen a truck parked in front of Anna Mae's house on Sunday night, but she couldn't remember the make and model of the truck, so by the time the investigators left the scene later that day, they really did not have much to go on. They considered the possibility that Anna Mae's fiancé might have committed the murder because the violence of the attack could indicate a crime of passion. But her fiancé was an old man who was not in the best health, and they had a hard time believing he had the strength to carry out the kind of attack that had taken place in the basement. So they knew they had to start looking for other potential suspects. So later that evening, several hours after the 911 call, investigators met with different members of Anna Mae's family. And several family members said they knew who police needed to talk to. Robert Prince, the man who rented a house from Anna Mae and recently claimed there were ghosts in his attic that Anna Mae was responsible for. With information about Robert Prince coming from Anna Mae's family, investigators focused their attention on him. And as they dug into his past, he quickly became their primary suspect. Police discovered that multiple people had filed assault charges against Robert, and some people who knew him said he had violent tendencies. It also turned out that Robert drove a truck that could fit the description of the truck Anna Mae's neighbor had claimed to have seen outside of her house on the night of the murder. And then investigators got a piece of bizarre news that made Robert look even more guilty. One of Anna Mae's nieces told police that on the afternoon of January 12th, just a few hours before Anna Mae was believed to have been murdered, Robert Prince had come to the niece's house. And when she had opened the door, he was holding a DVD player, and he said he had to sell the DVD player because he needed some fast cash so he could get out of town. The niece was not interested in buying this DVD player, and so she had sent Robert away, and she hadn't really thought much about it. But when she learned he was a suspect in her aunt's murder case, she wished she had said something to the police right after Robert had showed up at her door. So at this point, investigators believed they had more than enough to bring Robert in for questioning and to get a search warrant for his house. Now, the initial search of Robert's house did not turn up any evidence linking him to the murder, but investigators still saw him as their primary suspect. And so a couple of days after the murder, Robert arrived at the police station for questioning. And from the moment he walked inside, he was on edge. He talked almost nonstop as he followed an officer into a small interrogation room where Detective Troutman was waiting. In the interrogation room, Robert sat down at a wooden table across from Troutman, and right away, Robert's eyes began darting left and right, left and right. Robert had long brown hair and a large, thick beard. But what stood out to Troutman immediately was that Robert's right arm was in a sling. Troutman sat quietly for a minute and watched Robert shifting in his chair and looking over his shoulder. Then Troutman asked Robert if he was right or left-handed, and Robert said he was right-handed. Troutman did not let his face give anything away, but he wondered if maybe Robert had injured his right arm while attacking Anna Mae, and that was why it was in a sling. Then Troutman leaned in and asked Robert about his past assault charges, but Robert got really angry and said he would not talk about any of them. So, in a calm voice, Troutman said that was fine, and he did his best to get Robert to relax. And then he asked Robert to talk about where he had been on the day Anna Mae had been killed. Robert shifted some more in his chair and then started tapping his left hand on the table. Troutman just kept looking at him, patiently waiting for him to respond. And finally, Robert did. He said he had been traveling to Tennessee that day, so he'd been out of the state. Troutman nodded and then asked if Robert had any proof of this trip. Robert tapped on the table even louder and looked around the room some more. Then he faced Troutman and he said he'd stopped at a convenience store in a small town in Tennessee and that someone from that store might remember him. Troutman knew Robert was acting very strange and suspicious, but the detective was not ready to totally condemn the man just because of odd behavior in an interrogation room, a place where lots of people, guilty and innocent, can act very strange. Troutman knew it would take some time, but he was confident he could track down that convenience store Robert had mentioned in Tennessee and find out if anyone had seen Robert there on the day of Anna Mae's murder. And so, for the time, police would keep Robert at the top of their suspect list, but they didn't have enough evidence to actually hold him. So they told him not to leave town, but he was allowed to go. And over the next few days, while they looked into Robert's alibi, investigators tried to expand their suspect list. But even though the investigation was really just getting started, Anna Mae's family was already worried that law enforcement was not moving fast enough. On Friday, January 17th, 4 days after Anna Mae's body had been discovered, friends and family attended Anna Mae's wake, and the wake gave them all a chance to share stories about how much Anna Mae had meant to all of them. And after the wake, Anna Mae's brothers and sisters and their kids went to Earl's house. They sat together in the living room and talked about some of their favorite memories of Anna Mae. None of them could believe what had happened. And even though she had been 85 years old, they talked about how they'd always thought she would just live forever. And she had been so full of life and energy that they couldn't imagine what their family and what the town would be like without her. But as much as they wanted to focus on Anna Mae's life, they couldn't help but start to talk about the murder investigation. Many of them believed Robert Prince was the most logical suspect. But talking about Robert led to a discussion of all the other people who rented homes and properties from Anna Mae, and they started to wonder if the killer could just be anyone who might have gotten behind on rental payments. And if the list of suspects really was that long, the family worried that the local police and sheriff's department were not up to the task in front of them. And over the course of the week, no new information came in, and police still didn't have any evidence that would actually link Robert to the murder. So Anna Mae's family started to fear that maybe they had been right about the police, and they hated the idea that Anna Mae's killer was still walking free. And so some members of Anna Mae's family started to voice their opinions publicly, and soon the rest of the town joined them in putting pressure on investigators to solve this case. After all, a place that called itself the best town on earth, like Madisonville, couldn't have the brutal murder of one of its most prominent citizens just hanging over it. And things only got worse for investigators when wild rumors started to spread that there was a serial killer roaming the streets of Madisonville and that anyone could be their next victim and anyone could be the killer. Detective Troutman, Officer Rager, and the rest of the investigative team felt the tension growing in town. They'd only been working the case for about a week, but they were already getting loads of calls from residents day in and day out. Some of the calls were from people who thought they might have information that could help. But a lot of the other calls were just people demanding to know what police were doing to solve the murder and to make their town safe again. And so, as they tried to push the investigation forward and keep the town residents calm, Detective Troutman and Officer Rager both began to have a thought that they couldn't shake. They believed the extreme violence of this crime suggested the attack on Anna Mae had to have been personal. and they were almost certain that there had to be some piece of evidence connecting Anna Mae to her killer somewhere in her house. They just needed to find it. In late January, so over a week after the murder, Officer Rager returned to Anna Mae's house. The investigative team and forensics experts had searched the entire house and had combed the basement for evidence multiple times, but Rager believed there was a chance they had overlooked something in the large house. So she stepped inside, walked through the living room, and headed upstairs. And even though the house was still filled with all of Anna Mae's belongings, it felt cold and empty. On the second floor of the house, she walked down a hall towards Anna Mae's bedroom, and as she moved, the hardwood floors creaked under her feet. Then she stepped into the bedroom and went into the closet. She smiled when she saw all of Anna Mae's eccentric and luxurious clothes and shoes, but nothing else inside the closet stood out to her, so she stepped back into the bedroom and walked over to a small wooden desk in the corner. The desk had stationery, pens, and a few papers on it, but nothing that looked like it could help. Then Rager opened a desk drawer, and it was filled with loose papers and a book that looked like a journal. She pulled out the book, flipped it open, and immediately a look came across her face like she had just discovered buried treasure. This journal was a business ledger, and inside it, Anna Mae had kept detailed records of everyone who owed her money, from how much they owed and how much they had paid towards their debt. Rager knew something like this could change the course of the investigation, so she slipped the ledger into an evidence bag and then headed back downstairs and out to her car. And soon after, she met up with Detective Troutman and the rest of the investigative team, and they looked at this ledger, and they were all stunned by how many people had owed Anna Mae money. But as they looked further into the ledger, they would discover something that would bring the investigation into focus, and that discovery would soon make it clear to them who had killed Anna Mae. Based on information inside of that ledger, evidence at the crime scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Mae Branson in her home on Sunday, January 12, 2003. At about 7:15 p.m., Anna Mae's killer parked their pickup truck in Anna Mae's driveway, and then they sat there for a minute with the engine running. They stared out the windshield at the front door of the house and tried to tell themselves they were just there to get help, and that if Anna Mae agreed to help them, nothing bad would happen. The killer turned off the engine, reached over to the passenger seat floorboard, and grabbed the 2-foot metal braking bar that was propped up against the seat. Then they got out of the truck, hid the braking bar behind their back, and stepped onto the raised porch in front of the house. Then the killer glanced down at a large bone-handled knife tucked into a sheath on their belt. Then they took a breath and knocked on the door. Soon after, the door opened and the killer saw Anna Mae smiling back at them. The killer smiled, stepped inside, and tried to make sure Anna Mae could not see they were hiding something behind their back. Then the killer looked Anna Mae right in the eye and said they were in trouble and that she was the only one who could help them. But Anna Mae did not want to hear it, and she said she did not want to help. So the killer started yelling at her and said she had to do what they were asking, but Anna Mae started backing away and told the killer to leave. So the killer screamed that they just needed help, but Anna Mae kept shouting right back that they just needed to leave. And the killer's head started pounding, and Anna Mae's voice was making the pain worse, so the killer finally pulled out the breaker bar from behind their back and held it over their head in a threatening manner. Anna Mae saw it and screamed and turned and started rushing across the living room. The killer tried to catch their breath and stop their head from pounding. Then they grabbed the braking bar tighter and chased after Anna Mae. The killer saw her go down the hall, fling open the basement door, and close it behind her. So the killer rushed down the hall, opened up the door again, and saw Anna Mae at the bottom of the basement stairs. But the killer moved fast and caught Anna Mae as she stepped onto the rug in front of the basement couch. And once they caught her, they slammed the braking bar into the back of Anna Mae's head, and Anna Mae's body crumpled onto the rug, and blood began to run down the back of her head. Then the killer tossed the braking bar to the floor and stood over Anna Mae. The killer couldn't believe Anna Mae had not been willing to just do what they had asked. The killer's whole body started shaking, and they clenched their teeth. Then, almost unconsciously, they reached down and unsheathed the bone-handled knife on their belt, and then they crouched down above Anna Mae. The killer grabbed her by the hair and slashed the knife across her throat, Then the killer raised the knife up and began screaming and driving the knife over and over and over again into Anna Mae's back. Even though Anna Mae wasn't moving, the killer didn't stop, over and over and over. Finally, the killer stood back up, and they looked down and saw blood all over their clothes and hands and arms. In their rage, they had stabbed Anna Mae 97 times. The killer walked slowly away from Anna Mae's body over to the washer and dryer. There, they stripped off their clothes, put them in the washer, and did a load of laundry. Then they walked into the basement bathroom, started the shower, stepped in, and washed all the blood off. And after the shower, the killer put their clothes into the dryer. Then they searched the basement until they found cleaning supplies and wiped off any drops of blood they had left behind in the bathroom and on the basement floor, walls, and staircase. The killer took their time and remained calm. And when they thought they had wiped the basement clean, they walked back over to the dryer, took their clothes out, and got dressed. But for some reason, once their clothes were back on, the reality of the situation hit them. They saw Anna Mae's body lying on the floor, and all of a sudden they panicked. So the killer grabbed their weapons, stumbled up the stairs, and made their way through the house. Then they opened the front door, squinted to try to see in the dark to make sure nobody was there, and then they ran outside. The killer climbed in their truck, started the engine, threw it in reverse, and peeled out into the street. And then they put the truck in drive and floored it across town until they got home. And at 9:15 p.m., 2 hours after the killer had gone to Anna Mae's house, the killer walked back into their own home and tried to act like nothing had happened and just sat down casually on the couch. Then the killer's wife walked into the room and told him that she and the kids had really enjoyed catching up with his aunt, Anna Mae, that night at church. And the killer said, "Me too." Russell Winstead, Anna Mae's nephew, the one who had come by and been so concerned about Robert Prince and his ghosts, had been the one who murdered his aunt. The woman he said was like a second mom to him. It would turn out the ledger that investigators found in Anna Mae's house showed that over the course of the past year, Russell had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Anna Mae. And that information had led police to investigate Russell's finances, but they didn't just discover that Russell was in significant debt to his aunt. They discovered he was leading a full-blown double life. Unknown to any of Russell's family, including his wife, he had a severe gambling addiction and was having an affair with a casino waitress. And from Russell's financial records and interviews with that waitress, investigators found out that Russell had visited casinos in Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois 236 times in the past year, and that he had been known to lose over $30,000 on some of those visits. And when Russell's gambling losses started to affect his family and his everyday life, he had turned to his rich aunt, Anna Mae, for help. But he had told her the money he needed to borrow from her was for mining equipment. But as Russell kept coming back for more and more money, Anna Mae figured out he was lying, and she confronted him. And he admitted to her that he had lost all the money she gave him gambling. But he begged Anna Mae to please just lend him a little bit more so he could cover his mortgage payment so he and his family wouldn't lose their house. And he promised Anna Mae that he would pay her back. And then on that Friday before the murder, when Russell came over to talk to Anna Mae and they began talking about Robert Prince and the ghosts, Russell had given Anna Mae a check for $12,000 to prove that he was on his way to paying her back in full. But it turned out that Russell didn't actually have the money to cover the check he had written her. Instead, he went to a casino that night to try to win that money. But he ended up losing thousands of dollars instead. And so, on the night of January 12th, Russell drove to church separately from his wife and kids. And after the service, they all said hello to Anna Mae and caught up with her. And then Russell's wife drove home with the kids, and Russell got into his own truck and began driving around town, wondering what he was going to do. He had his braking bar that he used in the mines in the truck with him, along with his knife on his belt. And so he came up with this plan where he would ask Anna Mae to give him back the $12,000 check he'd written so she couldn't deposit it. And if she didn't give the check to him, he would threaten her with the weapons to make her do it. But things had not gone according to that plan. And when Russell arrived at his aunt's house with his breaker behind his back and his knife on his hip and demanded his aunt give him back the check that he had written her, Anna Mae said no, and she told him she was going to tell Russell's wife about his gambling problem and about all the money she had loaned him that he had lost gambling. And when Russell heard that, he flew into a blind rage, and he chased Anna Mae down into the basement and attacked her so violently that the majority of the wounds she suffered were inflicted after she was already dead. It would take months for the investigation to compile all of their evidence against Russell. But in June of 2003, over 4 months after the murder, they were ready to arrest him. But when authorities moved in on Russell's house, they discovered he had fled the country to Costa Rica, and they learned that Russell's father, Earl, was sending money he had inherited from his sister, Anna Mae, the woman Russell had murdered, to financially support Russell in Costa Rica. But with the assistance of Costa Rican authorities, U.S. federal agents were able to track Russell down, and he was arrested in Costa Rica, walking out of a casino. Russell was extradited to the United States, convicted of murder, and given 2 sentences of 25 years to life with a chance for parole in 2049. Earl would plead guilty to hindering apprehension, and he was given 2 years of probation. Anna Mae Branson is buried in Kentucky, and her family and members of the community still visit her grave often, over 20 years after her death.
On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared that the COVID-19 outbreak was so bad that it had become a global pandemic, which meant this new highly infectious disease had spread virtually everywhere on the planet. And so around the time this global pandemic announcement was made, governments around the world began instructing their citizens to stay home and avoid all physical contact with other people outside of the people that you lived with. The idea being these quarantine measures would help stop the spread of the virus. Initially, world leaders and citizens believed these quarantine measures would have a dramatic impact and it would stop the spread, and before long, COVID would be under control and life would just kind of magically go back to normal. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. By June, so 3 months into the global pandemic, positive COVID cases were only going up, not down. And so it was around that point in June that people all over the world were starting to come to terms with the reality that COVID was not this simple problem with a simple solution. It was a complex health issue that likely was going to be around for a long time, which also meant these strict quarantine measures also would likely be around for some time. Now, the efficacy of these quarantine measures were quickly called into question, and it was all over the news, and politicians, all they wanted to talk about was, do these measures work? Is it having an effect on the spread of the virus? But for everyday people, the real concern was not politics, it was practicality. How do you live a full and happy life in quarantine? In June of that year, 54-year-old Sandra Hughes was pondering that question. To that point, her life had really not gone the way she had planned it. She had been married, twice actually, but both relationships had ended in divorce, and she had never had children. She lived in beautiful Maui, Hawaii, but she hadn't really lived there long enough to consider it her home, and prior to that, for the bulk of her adult life, she'd kind of lived this nomad lifestyle, bouncing around all over the country, and so really she had never developed a home of sorts. She was an accountant by trade, but in college, she had studied not just accounting, but also wilderness survival, which she happened to be incredible at and was very passionate about. Growing up, she had always been a big outdoor enthusiast, and so she had always thought one day she would become a park ranger, and so that's why she was studying wilderness survival in college. But as these things go, after she graduated college, she did not become a park ranger, she became an accountant, and now, 30 years later, here she was. However, in June of that year, with COVID quarantine restrictions putting her and everyone else's life basically on pause, Sandra suddenly saw an opportunity, and that was to embrace this break from reality and spend this strange time in history back out in nature, getting back in touch with her roots as an outdoor survivalist. And so at the end of that June, Sandra would sell her place in Maui and she would move to Madera County, California, which is located smack dab in the center of California, situated just south of Yosemite National Park
and just north of the Sierra National Forest. Then, on June 26th, after Sandra had gotten settled in her new place in California, she would contact her family and tell them that she planned on going on this extended solo camping trip in the Sierra National Forest, and that she would be in touch with them in the coming weeks when she was back out. To Sandra, this trip was going to bring her lots of happiness and fulfillment, and it was going to allow her to continue to adhere to quarantine guidelines because she'd be all alone. Shortly after speaking with her family on the 26th, Sandra loaded up all of her camping equipment into her silver Saab sedan, and then she would drive from her place south and then east a little over an hour until she was deep inside of the Sierra National Forest. At some point, she would leave the main road and she would hop onto a bumpy dirt road that kind of wound through the forest, and that road would bring her out to an area called the Johnson Meadows. The Johnson Meadows are absolutely gorgeous. It looks straight out of a postcard. It's basically a stretch of beautiful green meadows, and then around the perimeter of those meadows are the thick trees of the Sierra National Forest, and then beyond those trees are the snow-capped Sierra Mountains. But despite its beauty, the Johnson Meadows are actually fairly dangerous. It's a very isolated part of the Sierra National Forest, and there are lots of cougars and bears and other natural hazards in the area, so it's not really a place you go unless you're prepared to be there. And Sandra was certainly that, both in terms of her survival experience and the gear she brought with her. So when Sandra drove her car right up to the edge of the Johnson Meadows, she parked her car off to the side of the road so as not to block the road, and then she got out, she collected her things from the trunk, and then she threw it over her shoulder and began hiking into the middle of the Johnson Meadows to look for a place to set up her campsite. 6 days later, on July 2nd, some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows and began walking across the center of it. And as they're walking along, they notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. They don't see anybody near it, but they clearly see someone is camping in the middle of Johnson Meadows. And so this is totally not unusual. Lots of people go hiking and camping in this area. And so these hikers just began kind of creating a wide berth around this person's campsite because they didn't want to cut right through the middle of it as they went across the meadow. But as they're making this kind of wide berth around this campsite, they looked over at it, and as they passed by it, they noticed that the campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed, like a tornado had crossed right across it. And so when they were parallel with this campsite, the hikers decided to actually go over and look at it and see what was going on. And so they walked over to this campsite, and they're looking around, and they see there's a backpack that's clearly been dumped out, and all of its contents are strewn around all over the ground. There's unopened cans of food, there's papers and documents, the tent is in ruins. I mean, the place is just a total mess. And so the hikers didn't really know what to make of this. They couldn't tell if a person had kind of intentionally ransacked this site, or if maybe an animal had come through. But as a precaution, they marked down on their map where this destroyed campsite was, and then they hiked out of the forest, and when they were back in cell phone range, they called the Madera County Sheriff's Office and they reported the site. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows, and sure enough, the campsite is still there, it's still in ruins, and it's still abandoned. And so they would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would leave the forest and get in touch with Sandra's family to find out if they knew why Sandra had left her campsite the way she had. But when Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they had an immediate and definitive reaction to it. They told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious and was very cleanly, and so she would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. The family would also tell the sheriffs that they had not spoken with Sandra since the 26th when she started her trip, and so they had no idea where she could be now. And so naturally, the family was concerned, the sheriffs were concerned, and so that day they filed an official missing person report. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched in Johnson Meadows and the surrounding area to look for Sandra.
And so hundreds of people were out on foot. They had sniffer dogs out. There were helicopters in the air. And during the search, the Madera County Sheriff's Office was interviewing anybody who was out there, hikers, campers, and asking them if they had had any contact with Sandra, because Sandra was actually quite distinctive looking. Before she left for this trip, she had dyed her hair blue. But unfortunately, no one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then on July 4th, so 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. And as these hikers walked past her, they definitely noticed her, but she didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra, and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office got really jazzed up. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, on July 5th, Sandra's vehicle was located, but Sandra was not with it. It was found 5 miles north of where her destroyed campsite was in Johnson Meadows, and the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine, and this ravine was right next to a winding forest road. And so after looking at the damage on the front of the car, authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. There was no blood inside the vehicle, so it wasn't immediately clear if this accident had actually done any physical harm to Sandra. But the most significant thing about the discovery of this vehicle was the state of Sandra's personal effects that had been in the vehicle. Clearly, after the vehicle had come to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car, all of Sandra's personal things, and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor, as if they were kind of rummaging through her car looking for something, throwing things as they went. And the Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked in Johnson Meadows, where all of her personal effects had just kind of been chucked all over the place. At this point, authorities did not believe Sandra was actively trying to evade them. Instead, they thought, maybe Sandra got hurt, maybe back at the campsite or even during this car accident, and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. There was some discussion about foul play maybe being involved, but that was largely discounted. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was at the bottom of the ravine, thinking, maybe Sandra is going to come back to this vehicle, and maybe that's why all these things have been strewn around, because she's coming back and looking for something. And so authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey, Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number if you see this. And then at the bottom of this note, it said, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days with a new focus around the area where the car had been found, but nothing new was discovered. Then, on the evening of July 12th, so 1 week after the vehicle was discovered, a team of searchers had made their way 2.5 miles north of the vehicle, and they were actually inside of Yosemite National Park. They were barely inside, and they were right up along this lake called the Spotted Lake. Now, this is an area that's very difficult to get to. There are no main roads that get there. There are no main trails that get there. And so the searchers, they're up in this very rugged part of Yosemite. And as they're walking along with their flashlights out, they see a sleeping bag, and it's laying out right in the middle of the ground, in the middle of nowhere. And it looks like it's been used recently. And it would turn out that sleeping bag was Sandra's. But again, when they brought all the searchers out to that area and they searched all around the Spotted Lake and all over this area, there was no sign of Sandra. At this point, authorities were totally baffled. On a map, Johnson Meadows, where her first campsite was, then her vehicle, and then this sleeping bag were all more or less in a straight line going south to north. It was almost like Sandra, from the day she went missing, had just begun slowly working her way to the north, but she was doing it without any equipment and most likely barefoot in an area that was steep and rugged and dangerous and full of cougars and bears. And so authorities knew if they didn't find her soon, even if she was doing this on purpose, she was likely going to succumb to the elements. The search for Sandra would continue for another week after the discovery of her sleeping bag, but by that time, by July 20th, there hadn't been any new developments. No one had seen Sandra, there were no new leads, and so unfortunately, the authorities had to scale back their search. About 3 weeks later, on August 9th, two hunters were driving down this very desolate forest road, located several miles to the east of where Sandra's car had been found. And as they're driving along, they turn this corner, and as soon as they do, they look up ahead, and they see there's this woman. Now, she's not standing on the road or even right next to the road. She's kind of tucked up a ways on this hillside in the trees, and she's leaning up against a tree. And so the hunters are looking at her, and they're seeing that she's got no equipment with her. There's no backpack, there's nothing, no tent, and there's no other people anywhere. I mean, they're in a very isolated part of this forest, and it's odd to see people here to begin with, let alone this woman who's just kind of casually standing up against a tree. And so the hunters, they're like, okay, let's drive up and see if she needs something. And so they pull up right up alongside her. She's still, 10, 15 feet away from them, tucked up in the trees. And so they roll their windows down and they're looking up at her, trying to kind of flag her and get her attention. But the woman is not paying attention to them at all. She just continues to prop herself up against this tree and just kind of stares off into the distance. And so the hunters, they're looking up at her thinking, what's going on with this woman? And they kind of called out to her. They tried to wave her down, but there was nothing. There was no interactions with them. And so ultimately the hunters thought, okay, well, we don't know what this woman's doing, but it seems like she's here on purpose and she doesn't seem like she's in distress. She doesn't look hurt. And so they just decided to carry on. And so they drove off, and then later that day, they would see one of the missing person flyers for Sandra Hughes, and they saw the blue hair in the picture, and they were like, oh my goodness. The woman we saw standing up against the tree in the middle of the forest was that woman, Sandra Hughes. The hunters would contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office and report this sighting, and they would describe Sandra as looking slightly thinner than the picture of her on her missing person flyer, and they would also say she was wearing overalls and a floral t-shirt, which was interesting to sheriffs because the last time Sandra was sighted, which was on July 4th, when those hikers had seen her barefoot with a bruise on her face near Johnson Meadows, she had been wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. And so clearly she had changed her outfit, but that didn't really make any sense because she had left all of her things at the campsite and her car, and so the whole situation was just totally weird to the sheriffs. But regardless, they headed out to that road where the hunters had seen Sandra, but like always, Sandra was not there, and there was no sign she had ever been there. After this, Sandra's case went cold, and so authorities and her family began to brace for the reality that they likely would never see her again. But there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, on Wednesday, July 21st, 2021, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children were driving in Jake's off-roading vehicle up the steep forest road in the middle of Sierra National Forest on their way to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. Shut-Eye Peak is a mountain in the Sierra National Forest with stunning panoramic views from the top, and it's located about 5 miles to the south of Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's first campsite was discovered. So Jake and his family, they're driving their way up this long, bumpy, winding forest road, making their way towards the top of Shut-Eye Peak. And when they get about halfway, the kids in the back start complaining that they're hungry. And so Jake and Victoria, they decide, you know what, let's just pull over at the next natural stopping point and we'll have a quick lunch and then we'll continue on the rest of the way. And as luck would have it, the road they were on would actually level off and lead them to this kind of short, flat section of the mountain. And in this flat section was this beautiful little meadow that butted up against some trees. And so Jake and his wife thought this is a great place to stop and have a little picnic. And so he pulled his truck over on the side of the road, he parked it, he turned the engine off, and then as Jake and his wife are kind of gathering up their things before they get out of the vehicle to go prepare this picnic lunch, they hear their 3-year-old son, named Caden, who's in the back seat right near a window, start talking.
And so Jake and Victoria instinctively turned around to see who Caden was talking to, and they saw Caden was not talking to himself, he was not talking to his siblings, he was turned and looking out his open window, looking across this small meadow into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation with somebody outside. And so Jake and Victoria, they see their son, and they look out the window in the direction he's looking and talking, and they don't see anyone. And so Victoria, she looks at her son and goes, "Caden, who are you talking to?" And what he would say to her would send goosebumps all over her body. And in fact, what would happen over the next several minutes from that point onward was so unsettling that Jake and Victoria decided, you know what? We're not going to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. We're turning around and we're leaving. And so they would speed out of the forest and they would get back home. And that night, Victoria would make a Facebook post about what her son said and this terrifying ordeal they experienced on Shut-Eye Peak, and she would post it. And that night, the Madera County Sheriff's Office would reach out to Victoria via a Facebook message, and they would tell her, "Hey, we saw your post. Can we please speak to you and your son?" And so the next day, the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, and after speaking with Caden and hearing what he had to say, they would leave that exchange just as unsettled as Caden's parents. The day before, when Victoria turned around and looked at Caden and said, "Who are you talking to?" Caden would turn away from the window and look at his mom, and he would say, "There's a woman out there and she needs our help," and he starts pointing out the window. And so again, Jake and Victoria, they look from their son back out the window into the tree line, which is where Caden is pointing, and they don't see anyone. And so they turn back to Caden and they say, "Honey, we don't see anyone out there." And Caden, at this point, he becomes emphatic and he says, "Mom, you gotta trust me. She's right there. She needs our help. She's lying face down. Her legs are straight up and she's dead." And so at this point, Victoria and Jake are looking at their son thinking, what's going on here? Jake promptly hops out of the car and just starts running into the woods to see what's going on. Is there a person out here? But he's out there looking around and there's no one. And while he's out there, his son is pointing in the direction of where he is, claiming there's this woman right near him. And so Jake's looking around thinking, there's no one out here. I have no idea what my son's on about. And so he's spooked. He runs back to the car. And when he gets inside, Caden is still looking out the window. He's pointing and he's talking to this dead woman that needs their help. And so Jake and Victoria, they were horrified. They turned around, they left. And then that night, when Victoria made that Facebook post, she included in the post what this woman apparently looked like based on what Caden said. And what Caden said was she had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair. And so when the Madera County Sheriff's Office saw this post that described seeing a person in a black shirt, blue jeans, and blue hair, they knew that description matched Sandra Hughes. And so when the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women. And they went right up to Caden, and without giving him any extra information, they just showed him all these pictures of all these women. And they said, "Caden, can you identify in any of these pictures the woman you saw in the woods?" And Caden looks at these pictures, and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs, along with Caden and his father, they would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak to search the tree line near the meadow to see if there was any sign of Sandra or any indication that she had been there, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her, and nobody has any idea what to make of the very strange sightings of her that occurred after she went missing. It's all just one big mystery.
Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sign the 5-star review button up for your very casual, very friendly, slow machine pitch baseball league. But when it's their turn at bat, switch the machine out for a grenade launcher. Also, please subscribe to the Mrballen podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mrballen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mrballen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mrballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts